When we think about medieval Europe, there's really three institutions that kind of stand out as things that really mark the Middle Ages. And those three are the power of the medieval church, um, the importance of chivalry and knights, and the institution of feudalism. And we're going to look at each of those institutions in turn, but this video in particular is going to focus on feudalism and some of the other economic and political structures that surround it. So one thing to think about is kind of how the medieval world saw the class system. Here's a depiction of essentially how the medievals divided the world. You've got those who work, would be peasants and farmers, those who fight, the nobility and the knights, and those who pray, the clergy. And when you think about how medieval society is set up, essentially everyone falls into one of those three categories. There's not really a middle class in the Middle Ages. There's a large percentage of people who are peasants. There's a small percentage of people who are nobility, who own the land, and then a small portion who are the clergy, the church people. One thing to think about is why feudalism was set up. So you might recall that after Rome fell, you don't really have a central institution of politics and governance in Europe. You've got a lot of farmers and some landowners, and certainly there's fighting a lot, but there's nothing really unifying them aside from, language or tribal affiliation or Christianity. As time goes on and we get into the 10th century, in the 900s, there starts a number of invasions of people we call the Vikings. Vikings are really just groups of people from Norway who went on these sort of pillaging conquests across Europe. Viking is really a term for what they did. In Norwegian, what they did was called to go Viking, and that was essentially to go raiding. And the Vikings were a warrior people who were pretty divided among a bunch of different tribes, clans, and kingdoms. And around 1,000 or so, they started to go out and move across Europe. Sometimes they were traders, but often they would find vulnerable places to attack. And because they were a seafaring people and had these nice shallow boats that could travel up rivers or through the Mediterranean, they really wreaked a lot of havoc in Europe because they were attacking monasteries and villages and other places without any real defense. And around the same time, you had a number of other invasions as well. You had a group of people from what's today Hungary called the Magyars who came into Frankish territory. And you also had Saracens or Muslims who raided from North Africa and Spain. So all this kind of caused, the nobility and the landowners in Europe to try and figure out what they could do to defend themselves. And that's they developed a particular system of feudalism. Now, we've seen feudalism before. If you might remember, in the Zhou dynasty in ancient China, you had a similar system where the king owned everything, all the land, but he gave land to some other warlords to rule in exchange for their service. That's essentially what feudalism is, where lords give land away in exchange for military service. Now, in medieval Europe, the feudal system became very important, and it kind of had a certain character. And here's some terms to understand. Essentially, in the feudal system, you have lords, that is to say, people who owned land, and they gave tracts of land, or sections of land called fiefs, to people called vassals, who worked on the land in exchange and ruled the land in exchange for service, usually military service. And also unique to medieval feudalism was the peasants. Most of the people who worked on the land were a group of peasants called serfs. Serfs were a particular kind of peasant that weren't really fully free. They weren't enslaved, they couldn't be bought and sold, but they were legally obligated to live and stay on the land on which they were born. It was their job to, work for the rulers of the land. So this really started around 900 or so. There was a king in Normandy who kept having to deal with Viking attacks. So he turned to one Viking, a guy named Rollo, and they made a deal. And Rollo swore an oath of fealty or loyalty. Here's an example of one. And this is from a depiction of Rollo swearing his allegiance to this Norman king. And these oaths of fealty were kind of what bound feudalism together. Most people at the time were still illiterate, so contracts didn't mean a whole lot. But swearing before God and man that the vassal would do as his lord commanded, as long as they both held up their end of the bargain, was really sort of what held these contracts together. Here's a diagram that kind of explains all the different functional parts of the feudal system. So the monarch is at the top, the king. And one thing to keep in mind is this idea we have that kings are like all powerful and everything they say is law wasn't really true in the Middle Ages. The monarch was just the lord who had the most land. We don't have absolute power kings until after the Middle Ages. So the monarch gives some of those fiefs land to his vassals, who are upper nobility, as well as church officials. Remember, church officials in the Middle Ages were also had a lot of political power. Those lords, these nobility, would give some of their land to knights. Knights were also nobility, but they were usually lower ranked than the upper nobility. And they controlled those bits of land, and on that land were serfs. So really all the way down you have land in the form of fiefs, and protection in that, if this noble's land got attacked, the monarch might call on his other nobles to send knights to defend it. Right? And then on the way up, you have food and service. For the serfs, they're performing the service of work. For knights, it was the service of military service of fighting. And for the nobility, it was the service of governance. They ruled those lands and dealt with the people there. And there's not a lot of money being exchanged here, not until later at least. In most of the Middle Ages, they're exchanging food. The food the serfs grow go to their lords, and they send food up to their lords, and they send it all the way up to the monarch. It's later in the Middle Ages that we really see money sometimes replace the exchange of food. Another part of feudalism, kind of the economic part, is what we call manorialism. So where feudalism is the structure, political and social aspects, manorialism is really the economic setup. The lord's house was called the manor, and all his land was also part of the manor. And that included the land that the serfs would live on. So the serfs live over here in the village, and all this land would be used for farming. You can see on this diagram here, all the green ones are common fields where the serfs would share, but they also have this demesne, or the strip of land that they would have to grow just for the lord. And one important thing to note is that all of this territory is owned by the lord. So if you're a serf, you're a peasant, and you want to, go make some bread. Well, first you have to take that grain and grind it in a mill, right? Well, the lord owns the mill, and so you'd have to leave some of the flour for the lord as a tax. Well, then you want to go bake it, you got to go over the bakehouse, and again, the lord would keep some of it as a tax. Lords had rights over really everything in the manor. The orchard, where they collected fruit, they'd get to keep that. The lord could hunt. Peasants were not allowed to hunt in the forest. That was a noble right. Serfs couldn't even leave their village without or marry, in fact, without the lord's permission. So the lord really had a lot of influence over his serfs, or her serfs. And life as a serf was generally pretty tough. You farmed most of the year. In the winter, you sort of just hole up in your village and wait out the cold of winter. Most of your life was influenced by your lord or by the church. And you can see in this case the priest lives next to the church, which is pretty typical. And most people really didn't travel more than 10 miles outside of their home. We tend to think today of how interconnected society is. That really wasn't the case in medieval Europe. Trading was uncommon until we get to the later Middle Ages. And if you had anything, it was made either by you or by somebody you knew in your village. So most people really didn't get around very much. The advantage here is that manorialism makes each of these manors really independent. There's not a need for trade. And that's pretty advantageous when you have to constantly worry about, Viking invasions or bandits on the highways or those kind of situations.